Welcome to Sarter TV, an idea sharing platform founded by Russell Sarter, who's an author, investor, and the CEO of Netcom Learning and AI Certs. We're speaking with Nelson Repenning, who's an MIT Sloan School of Management professor, about his new book, There's Got to Be a Better Way. Nelson, it's great to have you with us today. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and your career journey and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I came to MIT on my 23rd birthday in 1991, expecting to be here for 4 or 5 years for a graduate degree, and then I would sort of pursue the rest of my life. That was 34 years ago, almost exactly. So I got my PhD there and then joined the faculty and have never left. So I'm clearly a lifer at this juncture. And I think my origin myth or story, at least for the kind of work I do, is that when I kind of came of age as a scholar, the big topics back then were sort of the quality related tools. So this was during the rise of the Asian manufacturers like Toyota and so on. And being at MIT, the kinds of topics that most of my fellow graduate students were working on were not surprisingly very technical and mathematically oriented. So they were building tools and algorithms and so on and so forth. And frankly, I couldn't really compete. They were all pretty sophisticated. But I happened upon a kind of heretical question, which was, do people actually use these tools that we are spending all this time and energy developing? And the answer turned out to be at best maybe, and often not at all. And that's really been the question that I've worked on my entire life. And the sort of latest work that's captured in the book, we'll probably talk about a little bit, is really my answer to that question, both why does it happen and what you can do about it. So I've really spent my whole life kind of trying to help organizations take advantage of the knowledge that they already have.
Mm-hmm. And we will talk about your new book, There's Got to Be a Better Way. And you're a professor of system dynamics and organizational studies. For people who might not be familiar with the term, what exactly is system dynamics? And how do everyday business leaders use it, or why should they care?
Yeah, I think the best way for practitioners to think about it is there's a variety of sort of lenses and metaphors that we can use for organizations. They can be like families, they can be like pictures and so on. And system dynamics, I think, provides another one of those lenses. Its origin is in the feedback and control methodology that are often used in physical systems by engineers. So the cruise control in your car is an example of a simple feedback and control system. Your air conditioner is another one. And basically, so the founder of the field, Jay Forrester, who was an MIT legend, his real insight was that you could take some of those tools and use them to understand why organizations do what they do or don't do what they want to do. So it's a dynamic view of the organization, and it's one that really sort of turns on what are the different feedback loops that guide managers. And we can talk in different ways about how that metaphor often will help managers see different facets of their organization that might not otherwise be available to them or would be obscured in some of the other lenses that we would use.
So just going back to, your sort of your career journey and your background, was there a moment in your career or anything that you were studying that made you say, I need to understand why organizations work the way they do? What was that moment?
It's such a great question, and I was reflecting on that a little bit as I was getting ready for this session. And I think I went straight from undergraduate to graduate school and graduate school to being a faculty member. So, as I often joke, I have carefully avoided the real world. Now, in fact, all my research is with real companies, but, I've never really had line responsibility outside of, the academic environment. And I think that was an advantage for me in the following sense is I think the most formative moment is in those early days, again, when the kind of quality tools and Toyota production system were so big. I remember sitting in meetings and doing field work, and it often felt like a lot of what was happening was almost just a word game. And the one that really stuck out for me as I was reflecting on this is I remember one company I was working with was changing the words, we strive for customer satisfaction to we strive for customer delight. And, as a 23 or 24-year-old graduate student, like, I just didn't get it. Like, why was this word swap, going to be the secret to their, financial success and share returns and so on and so forth. And so I think it really allowed me to look at what was happening in organizations without the benefit of having really lived in them for a long time. And as I tell my graduate students now when they're looking for research topics, is that if you can sit in the middle of a large organization and kind of have beginner's mind in some sense, there's just a million crazy things that people do that we have all become kind of habituated to. And so I think it was certainly those word games and then looking at all the kind of crazy hype that was around those tools, which have become sort of part and parcel of existence, that really got me onto this topic. And we can probably come to this a little bit later. And then about 10 years later, when I was a faculty member, I started working in a couple different high hazard industries. Oil and gas was the one that I had done some research in. That was the place that I think really sealed the deal for me, because it turns out that what's required to run an oil refinery or nuclear power plant safely is pretty well known. There's books and people dedicate their whole careers to this. And as I started helping out with accident investigations, you could find places where, something bad had happened because someone had failed to do a really basic thing that everybody would agree was a good thing to do. And, in some cases, sadly, people died as a consequence. And I think that really was what kind of finished my conversion to, there's an important topic here, because organizations clearly know more than they do in many cases. And when they don't take advantage of that, well, in some cases, some really bad things can happen.
Mm. So then how is your approach to work design in the book different than traditional process improvement models like Lean or Six Sigma?
Yeah, so I think the way I sort of describe it is the work that we have done is heavily influenced by a bunch of different of the process improvement tools that are out there. So I think hopefully you would see in the book the best of Lean, the best of Six Sigma, the best of Agile. And I think what Don, my co-author, have tried to do is we've tried to get past the practices, right? So all the books are like, you should do this, you need to draw lines on the floor, draw your A3 this way, and try to understand the underlying principles of why these tools work. And so what I hope happens is that people can see our framework, which we call dynamic work design. We can talk about where that name came from in a second, is that they will see all those different tools in there, but with kind of the ritual stripped away so that they can get to the essence of why it works. And I think the reason we make such a big deal about that is one of the reasons that organizations often struggle applying a set of practices is they adopt them wholesale from another organization. So, if you take the energy industry as an example, there's one freeway in Houston where it seems like all the major oil companies are literally on that one road. And yet, one company will develop a set of practices that work really well, and another company who's literally across the street will try to adopt it and not succeed. And the reason that is, even if they're on the same freeway, they're different. Their cultures are different. Their people are different. The language is different. And often a practice to be successful has to be modified to move from one organization to another, even if they're very similar. And if you don't understand the why behind the principle, then it's very hard to make those modifications in a sensible fashion. So we're definitely inspired by those tools, but I hope we've come up with a more general framework. Sometimes we describe our framework as sort of the Rosetta Stone for process improvement frameworks, that you can see hopefully all the different instantiations in there, and hopefully in a sort of simpler, clearer way that strips away some of the sort of symbols and rituals.
Yeah. So can you share an example of system dynamics in action and your model?
Yeah, sure. So let's, there's two. So the one that I probably worked on the most is one of the things that you see if you study R&D environments is that organizations often have this strong propensity to put too many projects into their pipelines. So they, the research isn't great here, but, they probably take on between 3 and 5 times as many projects as they have resources to do. And, the reason for that is often simply that they're staffed by smart, competent people, and those smart, competent people have lots of good ideas. And when they have a good idea, they start working on it. But the consequence of that is that often product development portfolios look a lot like a highway on Friday afternoon in the summer, right? So we were talking about you're in New York, right? Think about the freeway to Long Island on Friday afternoon, right? It's jam-packed and none of the cars are going anywhere. And that's what the R&D portfolio looks like for a lot of companies. And so what's happening there, the dynamic is that people are sort of making locally smart decisions, right? They have sort of, their local feedback loop, which is, I have a good idea, let's start it because it probably help the company. And what they're missing is the consequence of all those local decisions doesn't add up to something that really works for the organization. And so one of our principles, and we can get to the other ones, is what we call regulate the flow. And the basic idea about that is, have a feedback loop or a control rule or a policy or whatever you want to call it that says we only add new work to the system as long as the work is flowing, right? And so if we go back to the traffic metaphor, don't put another car on the highway if it's gridlocked, and yet organizations do that all the time. And what you find is that when you only add work when the work is moving so that you sort of resist the urge to overload, the velocity of those projects increases by so much that as the academic, I'm sometimes kind of scratching my head, like, are these results really real? But we often see 4- and 5-fold improvements in the productivity of those systems.
So can you give us an example from your book where, fixing the design or this process flow of the work actually changed results dramatically?
Yeah. So one of the things that I can't say that I knew exactly that this was going to happen when we started, but about 10 years ago, my co-author and I, Don Kieffer, started a course in our executive MBA program at MIT where they have to do projects using our framework. And it has turned out to be a fabulous engine to generate examples. So we have hundreds of examples of successful projects throughout the book, but our lead users for our technique has been the team at the Broad Institute. So the Broad Institute, it grew out of the Human Genome Project. They're right across the street from my office. The whole lab there is run by my former students, which is just, luck on my part. And they were able to, when we first met them, they had the overload problem really intensely in both the lab where they process the samples and then in their technology development environment. And so one of the simple techniques that we help them develop is what we call visual management, which basically boils down to take each project that you're working on, just put it on a Post-it and put it on a whiteboard. And on the whiteboard, just draw a little sketch of your product development process. So we have an idea phase, we have a development phase, we have a testing phase, and so on and so forth. And when you do just that exercise, the first thing that happens is that they discovered, oh my gosh, we had no idea how much work that we had in this. And it turned out that there was no single person in the organization that was aware of every project that they were working on. Now, this is easy to understand, right? These are some of the smartest people in the world, and they would have a new idea and they would just start working on it, not realizing that they were contributing to the gridlock. And so once they got it on the board, for probably 2 years, Don, my co-author, and I would walk over there and like, look, you need to take about half these projects out. Oh, well, we can't get rid of this one because it's so important and we can't get rid of that one. I was like, look, you only have so much capacity. And so if you put more in there than you have capacity, you're going to sort of gum up the works. And so with time, they developed a much better sense of what they could really handle. And they fall off the wagon and kind of get back on it every so often. But they've probably increased the productivity of their R&D process by about 4 times, which is, again, as an academic, sometimes I can't believe these numbers are so big. And, Don and I sometimes joke, like they did this with, just Post-its and markers and a whiteboard. And Don and I couldn't sequence a genome if our lives depended on it, but we do know a little bit about the process. And so just getting flow and a smart rule for when we let projects into the system, just led to enormous gains. And they were able to regain an industry-leading position that they've been able to hang on to ever since.
Yeah. So you also talk about work design a lot. So what's the difference between work design and improving a process?
So it's a great question, and we chose the design word very deliberately to sort of capitalize on, I think, a gap in our thinking, which is that as human beings, we are totally comfortable with the idea that the physical world is designed to fit us, right? So the chair that I'm sitting in, the phone I use, all the technology you and I are using today, right, has been pretty carefully tuned so that it fits our interests and the user interface works and so on and so forth. And yet, when it comes to our jobs, sort of in the social or work world, we don't tend to configure the work so that it fits the humans that are doing it. And so we chose design just to get managers to think about, have you designed your job? Have you designed your organization? Have you sat back to think about it in sort of the bigger picture? I think if you're a skilled process improvement expert, the process that we preach is probably not going to look all that much different that we're using. So I don't think there's actually substantively a huge difference between process design and process improvement. But what we really wanted to catalyze was this mental shift, is that you have a set of wonderfully flawed human beings that are doing work for you that have strengths and weaknesses. And we should configure the work in ways that capitalize on those strengths and offset those weaknesses, rather than, I often ask my students, like, how many of you ever designed your job? And they kind of look at me like I'm nuts. Well, I just showed up at work and I started working, right? It doesn't occur to people. And yet, if you bought a pair of shoes that didn't fit, right, you would get rid of them. And yet we don't do the same thing, when the job doesn't fit, our sort of strengths and weaknesses and interests.
Mm-hmm. And your book also highlights organizational execution gaps. Tell us about that. What's the most common one you see, and why is it so persistent?
So I'm going to have a very hard time probably getting down to the most common one, but let me give you a couple layers, probably three at least to start with. I think one, and this is one that I've only appreciated later in my career, is I think an execution gap I see all the time, particularly with senior leaders, is they often assume that people understand what they mean. Right. So there is this thing in psychology that's known as the curse of knowledge, which is basically the idea that once you know something, it's very hard to put yourself in the shoes of a person who doesn't know that thing. And so if you think about the way, as an example, senior executives go about organizational change, right? They'll sit in the conference room with their colleagues and some consultants for weeks or months, and they'll scribble on the whiteboard, and they're thinking really hard about what are we going to do next? Maybe we're going to change the organizational structure, or we're going to go into a new market, or whatever it might be. And then when they're done, they make a set of slides and go out and do some 45-minute town halls around the company and assume the organization is now on the same page with them. And I think psychologically speaking, that's just not the case, right? They don't understand that it took them that 6 weeks to develop that mental model, and they just grossly underestimate what's going on. So the practical advice that I often give is you need to think of strategy setting and target setting as a social process. And what I mean by that is people need the opportunity to ask questions, because the first time they see the slides and they hear the new strategy, they might think they understand it, but there's no way that they understand it as deeply as the person who's been sitting in that room for the 6 weeks. So I'd say that's number one. I think number two, which we talked about, is just overload. Most organizations just take on way too much work, and I think managers don't fully appreciate the consequences of overloading their organizations. And then the third one, which we make a big deal about in the book, is I think we are headed to a world in where we use email and all the sort of associated electronic communication methods and face-to-face communication in almost exactly the opposite order, right? And this was a big insight that Don and I had, is that when we're dealing with some ambiguous piece of information, we need to make a tough decision about a product or, an HR case. The fastest way to process that is to have a face-to-face communication, right? Because we have a wide palette. You could see me moving my hands and the change in my voice, right? Email or Slack is a very flat communication environment. And so the execution gap I see over and over again is that when people try to process difficult or ambiguous information via email or Slack or whatever, what you get is just endless iteration, right? And we all know this, right? Our email inboxes are overflowing, and it takes 12 emails to figure out where we're going to have lunch or what we're going to do next. And often a 30-second face-to-face conversation or a Zoom conversation, can make all the difference in terms of getting that work to flow through the organization.
Certainly, yeah. What would you say is the most common broken work design that you see in companies?
This is a little bit biased, I think, by the kinds of work I tend to do, which is obviously R&D is a place I've studied. But I would say the most broken one that we see is that there's not a clear gate for letting work into the system. So one of the metaphors that we often use in class is, if you think about going on a commercial airline flight, right? We often ask the students, when's the last moment that the airline can change that passenger list? And, barring a major calamity, right, it's usually when the door shuts, right? So when they shut that airplane door and the jetway pulls back, that plane is going, and if you're on it, you're going, and if you're not, you're waiting for the next one. And so using that metaphor, we often recommend to people that for every process, you need an airplane door, right? Which is sort of the point of no return, where once we let that work in, it's going to go. And the reason that's so important is I remember I once gave that airplane metaphor to a bunch of software engineers, and like, oh, we don't do it that way at all. We let the airplanes get up in the air, and then we bring them back, and then we reconfigure them. And what he meant is they would start projects, get them started, get a team assigned, and then, oh, we don't want to do that, we want to do this. And then they would move to something else, and they'd come back to the first one. And that kind of churn just creates a huge amount of headache and wastes a ton of ton of organization. So I think not having that clear airplane door and just sort of letting projects come in from wherever and just letting people sort of start on something when they want to, I think, again, it's just 100 times more expensive than people give it
Yeah,
credit for.
sure. So if I'm a manager in a mid-sized company, what's the first step I can take today to improve my team's work design?
So I would suggest going back to my first failure mode is just make sure that your organization is actually clear on what you actually want from them. And every time I say this, executives, well, of course they are. I do town halls and so on and so forth. But my colleague Don invented this little technique that I think is a great way to check this. That's pretty low cost. We call this process barbecue the boss. So have an hour-long meeting with, your sort of direct reports and maybe the next layer, give a 10 or 15-minute presentation about, what you think the strategy is and what the targets are, and then hand out Post-its and give 3 Post-its every person and just have them write questions. What are their questions that they had from this? And you'll get some similar ones, cluster them, and then, start peeling off the clusters and answering the questions. And every time we've done this, we've discovered that, the executives are shocked at the questions they're getting about what's going on. And again, it's often just not nearly as clear in the minds of the people doing the work what they're supposed to do as the executive thinks. And it's just because it's not that, they're not smart enough. They just haven't put a lot of time into thinking about that. And no big surprise, that problem is much worse when you're in rapidly changing environments, right? So if it's a very stable organization, it may not be such a big deal. But if you're in, where the technology is changing and the markets are changing and the policy environment is changing, then I think it's very hard to keep people on the same page. And just creating that opportunity to ask questions makes it into that two-way social process that I think really can help a lot.
Yeah, and you're obviously in your work, you're talking about new ways of working, new ways of doing things, implementing changes. How do you get folks to embrace new ways of working when they're used to doing things the way it used to be done?
Another significant challenge. And so here's what I would suggest you not do. Don't tell people, oh, I read this book or I saw this podcast, and so we're going to do everything differently all at once, and print up some T-shirts and coffee mugs that go with that. I think that strategy has been proven over and over again not to work. So what we recommend is to pick a problem, what we call scope it down, and pick a small manifestation of that problem, one where you think you can make progress fast. One of the little examples we use is, I don't have to boil the whole ocean to figure out, what the boiling point of water is, right? Start with a little thimble and figure it out. So pick one problem that's on the critical path of the work you do. And then this is the hard part for senior executives is go get involved in that work and see what's actually happening, right? Go watch that problem happen. And when we ask our students to do this, it's funny, my students are actually doing this investigation right now as we speak. If you don't find things that are embarrassing, you're just not looking closely enough. And I think this is a real eye-opener for my students and other executives, because when they go see the work and they go see the problem happen, what they realize is that they have accidentally configured the design in ways that make that work really hard to get done. And the process as a consequence is this kind of amalgam of the formal process, what's supposed to happen, and then all the little workarounds that people have created to actually get the work done. And over the years, Don and I have collected this kind of hilarious rogues gallery of the things that people have discovered along the way. And I give you just 1 or 2 examples. So we had a student a few years ago that went and did the go see and assess, we call it, so go see the work. And he discovered that they had a full-time person that took every piece of engineering documentation, printed out and filed it in this huge room with these fancy printers, even though they'd had a robust electronic repository for that information for more than 5 years. So it was an entirely redundant activity that nobody in the senior ranks knew was still happening. We had another case a few years ago where a student mapped out a process that was basically an invoice that was getting paid, so pretty sort of routine thing. And there was a step in the process called waiting for the GL code. So that was the general ledger code, and it was 3 days to get the general ledger code printed on the invoice so that it could get paid. Someone asked the question, well, how many GL codes are there that are relevant to this process? And it turned out the answer was 1. So they were waiting 3 days for a piece of information that could have literally been printed on printed on the form. I'll give you one more. This one's a little bit more sobering, but I had a student this year that is a kidney transplant surgeon, and his project was around turning over the operating room so they could do more procedures. And as he went and watched the work, he was watching them sort of get the operating room correctly. The nurses would open the packs that had the equipment, so the scalpels and all the other sort of sterile stuff. And as he's watching, they would sometimes open 6 or 8 of these packs before they got ones that were actually clean, that didn't have what they called bioburden on it, which you can probably imagine is, unsavory and probably not what you want on the instruments for your surgery. And that led to this whole inquiry into, well, how are the instruments sterilized? And it turns out the machine didn't work. And it turns out the people doing it didn't know why this was so important. And so just that little observation revealed, a multitude of improvement opportunities to make it work better. So go see the work and get involved. It's kind of a superpower, I think, for senior executives. And I would also say, it's the easiest thing in the world not to do if you're a senior leader, right? Because you're very busy, you've got a lot of stuff going on, it's hard to carve out time in your calendar, but if you can make that time, it is enormously educational about what's happening in your organization.
Yeah. And, we have AI that's becoming more and more prevalent in everything that we do. How do you think AI is going to change, work design, process improvement in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I feel like we have seen this before in a much smaller version, which was, when I was a young PhD student, even before that, automation and robots were getting very popular in the manufacturing world. And there's a very famous case where at one point in the mid 80s, General Motors decided that they were going to create lights out factories. They were going to use robots, for everything and get rid of labor, and they were going to save themselves a lot of money. And this is how they were going to beat Japan. It turned out it was a formidable challenge to, in one step, use robots everywhere. And there were some funny examples we just unearthed where the robots would paint each other or weld the doors shut, or it was really a difficult challenge to make it work. And basically the GM effort never succeeded. Now, if you look at a factory today, there's automation and robots everywhere. So the problem wasn't the idea. The problem was the path of the strategy they chose to get from A to B, right? They tried to do it all at once. And the process is just too complicated. And the reason it's too complicated kind of connects to something we were talking about a few minutes ago, is because every process is a mix of the formal process and then all the little workarounds that the people doing the work have added to actually get the work done. And so what I see with AI is I think the people that are going to try to use it everywhere all at once are really going to struggle for exactly the same reason. And so I think an incremental strategy of pick the places where AI can create a lot of value, run some simple experiments, get to understand the technology, understand how the work is actually done, and then move on to the next one is likely to be a much more sustainable, successful effort. So there's no question that 20 years from now, work processes are going to look enormously different thanks to AI. I think the ones that succeed are going to have a little bit more of a sort of learning incremental mindset rather than the sort of hype. I mean, I'm at MIT. You can't walk 2 feet without hearing AI. I think we have AI-enabled sandwiches in the cafeteria at this juncture. But I think if you go too fast, right, you're going to risk sort of repeating the history that I think we had with the robots from before. So.
Yeah. And finally, what are 1 or 2 key learnings you hope people take away from your new book, There's Got to Be a Better Way?
Yeah, I think I would say, number 1, we've talked about this a couple times, but really be judicious about the amount of work that you put in the system and start thinking very carefully, just how does the work actually get in there? I think number 2, realize that target setting is a social process and just find ways to get people to ask you questions about what is the strategy, what is the mission. And then we haven't talked about this one as much. And I think this is another place where AI might be a little bit of impediment, but I've come to believe that face-to-face communication is one of the most valuable resources that organizations have. So you think about, if we have a meeting of 10 people, that's 10 hours of work that's not getting done. We want to use that meeting for what it's good for. And what those meetings are good for is sort of dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty. And I think if you can use meetings correctly so that there's two-way exchange rather than me just telling you what to do, you'll get much more value out of that pretty expensive venue.
Great. Well, Nelson, this was really insightful. Thank you so much for joining us and for providing
my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. And we'll see you next time on Sarter TV.